Welcome to Cross Party Lines. It's a podcast designed to unpack New Zealand politics so that you don't have to. And the one thing we ask of you is if you are enjoying this podcast, please share it with friends because we're trying to grow a bit of a community and help inform and engage all sorts of New Zealanders on the important decisions being made in Parliament on our behalf. And actually, speaking of sharing stuff, Phil, this afternoon I was just moseying around on my Facebook page and I see your old friend and colleague Helen Clark is sharing some of our content on her Facebook page as well. Did you have to ask her to do that or did she just do it on her own behalf?
No. Helen is entirely self-motivated. There are two people that whenever I text them, I get an instant reply wherever they are in the world. One is Helen Clark and the other is Jacinda Ardern. These people must live with their cell phone by their head or by their pillow even. I can
Completely
sometimes
attached.
take ages to get back to people, but they are both terrific. You ask them a question and they're back in touch with you in no time at all.
Well, she must be liking the content. The content. What do you reckon, Chris? Are we ever going to get Mr. K or Mr. English sharing some of our videos on their pages?
I think it's Sir John and Sir Bill to you. I don't
Consider
know.
myself told.
Maybe they think I'm too independent. I don't know. But we'll wait and see.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Winston Peters, who has just begun speaking up a little bit against his own coalition. We've got the McSkimming case, which has obviously exposed a bunch of structural issues in the police oversight. We're going to talk about whether there's an easy fix to that or if this is just a really, really complicated situation. And then we're going to finish on the Regulatory Standards Bill, which passed its third reading last week. What is it? What does it mean? And how should we be looking at it? But let's get straight into it. Phil, what do you think's going on here with Winston?
Well, he's hugely political, and this is all being done as part of a political plan. In fact, when Mr. Peters came over to London and I was working with him on his tour, the interesting thing was, first of all, the first appointment he made was not with the British Foreign Minister, it was with Nigel Farage. So there's a role model for Winston Peters, and clearly Nigel Farage has been incredibly successful with that populist approach that he has taken. But he also said something, and he's probably said it publicly as well, so I'm not disclosing any confidences. He said, the first half of this term, I've focused on being foreign minister. The second half, I'll be campaigning for re-election. And that's exactly what he's doing. It didn't surprise me at all that he thought that the talk by Christopher Luxon about asset sales was tawdry and silly. Winston has always been against asset sales. What really surprised me when he said that they've resorted to this because their economic policies are failing. And it was almost as if he wasn't part of the government that he was talking about. And they are, of course, failing in public opinion because for the first time for as long as I can remember, Labor is leading national in terms of the public opinion polls on who would be the better economic managers. Now, we've seen Peters before at this, when he was part of the Bolger coalition government and then with Shipley. As soon as it looked like the government wasn't going to be re-elected, he wanted to distance himself from it to the extent that he finally walked away from it. So he knows that the public aren't happy about the cost of living. You've just seen the prices and that further increases way above what people's wages are going up by on food. He is wanting to set himself out separately because he knows too often the casualty in a coalition government will be the minor party. So he's setting himself out to say, I'm separate from them, even though he has collective responsibility with them for the policies that they're pursuing.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction to be made about being a confidence and supply partner, which is what he was, Phil, with Helen and you from 2005 to 2008, and being in a full coalition as he was from 2017 to 2020 and again is now. And I find it extraordinary that he made those remarks about economic policy because he is part of the coalition. He's not confidence and supply. He's part of the coalition. And I was absolutely dumbfounded because I thought, and Phil and I together have about 25 years ministerial experience. You are bound by the decisions of cabinet. You can air your views inside the cabinet room, but once the decision is made, that's it. You go out there and you work with it, and that's regardless of political party and regardless of personality. Economic policy, as we know, is pretty much at the heart of any government, and this government is dealing with some very big economic issues. But he's not some kind of sideline observer. He is a participant, and a very senior one, in the coalition government. In ordinary circumstances, such a display of, some would say, petulance would be met with instant dismissal. But he seems to get away with it. But I do genuinely find it quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I was having a look at the cabinet manual, and it says quite interestingly this is about coalition government, so it makes
Yeah.
provisions for agree to disagree, but it says, and I'm quoting, any public disassociation from cabinet decisions by individual coalition members outside the agreed processes are unacceptable. Now, I doubt that he had an agreed process to say that the government was failing in its economic management. As you said, Chris, look, there's all sorts of things that you can have your own independent line on, but economic policy, economic management is the core to any government. And for a senior minister and a leader of a coalition partner to come out and say this government is not fixing the economy as it promised, as if he was separate from that government, is really quite extraordinary.
And you see, but he has form on this, because between 2017 and 2020, he was very much part of a coalition government with Jacinda Ardern. Actually, Shaw and the Greens were confidence and supply, as I understand it. And he was at the table when all the key decisions were being made on the COVID-19 response. But his attitude to those matters since he left that coalition and, of course, left Parliament, again left me very, very surprised. And indeed, the Royal Commission into COVID-19 seems to begin with an inquiry that immediately postdates his involvement, where so many key decisions were made. So his ability to disassociate from the government of which he was a member is very, very surprising, and I would say wholly unconstitutional.
So at a technical point, Chris, that is 100% correct. But at the ballot box and with people voting for him, this is a successful strategy. So is this going to be successful again? Is he going to be able to sort of do this Houdini where he was deputy prime minister for 18 months and Houdini his way out of it and say, it was those guys, not me?
Oh, I think that his ability at self-preservation is very, very impressive. And he talks about democracy and holding parties accountable, but he's been the only leader of New Zealand First since 1993. 1993. And he's been through various governments of various types, but he seems to emerge from it. You call him Harry Houdini. I say it in the nicest possible way. So often he reminds me of Rasputin, because simply saying, Rasputin had to be thrown in a naver, given poison cakes, shot, given poison alcohol, and still he survived. And Winston has this extraordinary capacity, and I admire him for his stickability.
A clove of garlic and a wooden stake through the heart might be what's required. But look, it's not surprising. Most of his supporters are people who are anti-government and anti-authority, and therefore it comes really hard for them when their guy is part of that government and part of the decision-making that they don't like. So what he's basically doing is appealing to that group of people, even to the point, remember Winston was the one, I absolutely deplore the fact that somebody attacked his house. You just don't do that, and I have no time for that at all. But remember, Winston was the guy when they had pictures of a noose and a gallows hanging Jacinda Ardern in the forecourt of Parliament. He was the one that went around and talked to the protesters there. So, when he recalled Trevor Mallard, I don't know whether Trevor's back yet, it was a purely symbolic thing. This was the guy that was Speaker of Parliament that turned the hoses on you. So I'm recalling him from Dublin. Did he recall him 18 months ago when he became Foreign Minister? No, when he had about 3 months left to go in his term. So look, everything's a show for Winston. Nothing is serious. He doesn't believe a lot of what he talks about. Mike Moore, I always remember what Mike Moore said to me about Winston. And he and Winston were, they got on pretty well together. He said, the thing about Winston Peters is he doesn't believe what he's saying. The problem is the people who follow him believe what he's saying, and he winds up those people with all the appalling prejudices they often have about, migrants being undermining our society and so on. And that's Winston. He is an actor. He's a showman. He doesn't have a firm set of beliefs and principles that guide him to do what is ethically right. He does what he thinks will be politically advantageous. That's the definition of populism.
But you've got to admire him. 1993 to still be around, that takes some doing, and he's been through several governments. But I have to say that the comment, coming back to the principle, the comment about economic policy breached the cabinet manual in my view.
And Chris,
it did, and he doesn't care.
We talked a little bit about the cabinet manual in some of our bonus episode about Gough Whitlam last week. Can you just explain why it's so important to basically have those decisions that are made in cabinet around that table with all the coalition partners present? Why is it so important that then MPs come out and toe that line?
Well, it's not really towing the line. It's a fundamental aspect of constitutional government that you have your full and frank exchange of views within the cabinet room at the cabinet table, and then a decision is made, and you won't put aside party or coalitions or whatever. You can't have stable government or government that will have the confidence of the people if people are running off in all directions and rubbishing decisions that have been made by their colleagues. It won't work. And Phil and I, as I say, between us, we have 25 years ministerial experience, and we both know the rules of the game. You will have a very good scrap at the Cabinet Committee room, and then if the issue goes up to Cabinet for full discussion, but once the decision is made, you live by it or you surrender your ministerial warrant. And I can't for a moment, coming back to John Key or Helen Clark, think that if this kind of thing went on when she was Prime Minister or he was Prime Minister, it would be tolerated.
Absolutely not. And, the thing about what Winston does is that he constantly, in what he says, demeans Christopher Luxon's position as Prime Minister. So, I remember when Luxon, I agreed with his comment, he said that there was a trade war when Trump was launching into his, 200% tariffs on China, etc. And Peters came out without saying Luxon's name, but said, he deplored this talk about trade war. There was no such thing. Well, I don't know what world he was living in. There is certainly a trade war, and we know who launched it. But, and the comment of when Luxon talked about that he had pushed for this and succeeded in getting this free trade agreement when he was up in Asia, and he was reprimanded by Peters saying, we, not I. Now, every one of those things are little things, but piece by piece, they undermine the authority of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister would normally be the first Foreign Minister of the country. That's always been the case for as long as I've been involved in politics. But, Luxon is clearly now frightened to speak out on foreign policy for fear that he will end up in conflict with Peters. And that does his image no good, and the sense of leadership that you'd expect from the Prime Minister no good. Again, Winston Peters knows that, but he doesn't care.
And I mean, Phil's right. For many, many years, be it Keith Holyoake, Norm Kirk, Bill Rowling, David Lange in his first term, all these folk were ministers of foreign affairs, but no prime minister needs formally to hold the portfolio because that person is de facto the number one minister of foreign affairs and necessarily has to be involved in issues. So it goes without saying that the prime minister should be able to say whatever is appropriate about a foreign affairs issue, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs himself or herself just falls into line. And you don't need to hold the portfolio. The Prime Minister must be involved in foreign affairs.
And do we think, and this is, we're sort of going into speculation here, but do we think if the Prime Minister was to reprimand and pull Winston Peters into line, do we think that would be the straw that broke the coalition's back? Is there any surviving that, or is Winston in such a mood at the moment as we go into 2026 that should someone try and pull him into line, then he's walking away?
Excellent question. I think he's. I think the Prime Minister's in a very difficult position because he'll want to be bringing this coalition to full term, and so maybe he's adopted a position of the less said, the best said. But it doesn't stop commentators like us saying it's totally inappropriate.
Yeah, you need a prime minister that leads from the front, and at the moment, we're not seeing that. I mean, the other example I'd use is that when Peters gives his speech about migrants, as he did a couple of weeks ago or a little bit longer ago to the New Zealand First Conference, and he said he deplored migrants who didn't salute the flag, weren't grateful for the people that had gone before them, and tried to impose their religion on others, basically saying that migrants were unpatriotic, ungrateful, and they were all Islamic extremists. Did we hear one word of rebuttal from Christopher Luxon, or for that matter, David Seymour, about those comments? No, they were absolutely silent. Yet I do remember Jim Bolger getting stuck into Peters, might have been before they were in coalition, about Peters being racist in terms of Peters led the Asian invasion campaign of the 1990s when he was against the Chinese and the Indians coming to New Zealand. He's not quite so overt this time, but Jim Bolger did speak out against that. Christopher Luxon has been notable by his silence.
And I know, Sam, you've cautioned both Phil and me as we develop this program not to delve into ancient history. But the fact of the matter is he's been around since 1993, but the basic themes have been the same for years and years and years. And the immigration one that Phil mentioned is just part of it. So, yeah, I know we can't go into ancient history, and 1993 is ancient history, but for those of us who watch politics, we just yawn when we say, oh, here's the latest variation on a theme that's been around for over 30 years.
Peters, let's look at it in context. Peters was elected in 1978 for the first time in the seat of Hunua. He originally stood for Northern Maori, which is funny because he was then later opposed to having Maori electorates. And then he got elected in 78. He went out in 81. He came back in 84.
And you're absolutely right. I'd forgotten that he stood for the first time half a century ago against Matt Rata up in Northern Maori. So it's been around a long time. He'll be very pleased we don't have term limits in this country.
Just goes to show with experience doesn't always come wisdom.
Hey, let's move on to the next topic for the day. Obviously, the biggest news of the last week has been the Javon McSkimming case with the New Zealand police. And there have certainly been some tawdry details, to borrow a term from Winston Peters, actually. But we want to focus more on the structural issues that we need to sort of define and fix to stop this happening again. There have been calls to introduce an Inspector General of Police or beef up the power of the IPCA, the Independent Police Conduct Authority. Chris, I know we're still in the thick of it, but what's your take on what we know about so far from the response?
Yeah, well, let me emphasize there's a lot of talk at the moment about employment situations and so on. And I think justice demands that we don't go there and talk about people and talk about allegations of corruption and everything else. But there is an important issue that I think Brian Roach raised as the head of the public service, which I think we can usefully talk about. and that is you've got these organizations within the state that wield enormous power. The armed services, the security and intelligence services, and the police. And without being sort of too historical, the whole basis of the police and their raison d'etre depends on the consent and the goodwill of the public. So, and that they're not my words; it's a paraphrase of what Robert Peel, who introduced the bobbies,
Peelers.
hence the name, all those centuries ago. And so you've got to make sure that the public has confidence in the Defence Forces, the Security and Intelligence Service, the GCSB, and the police. And so given what's happened, I actually think mature and careful reflection about an Inspector General of Police is a very worthwhile idea. And I go back to, I was made Minister in charge of the Intelligence Services, the first non-prime ministerial Minister in charge of the Intelligence Services in 2014. I recall that at the time Winston was very critical of the move, saying that the portfolios inevitably should be with the Prime Minister. But since 2014, no Prime Ministers held those portfolios, National or Labour, because Andrew Little was in charge of them, and now it's Judith. And the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security at the time was Cheryl Gwynne, and she made life difficult for the intelligence services. And one of them said to me one day, she was starting to have a chilling effect on the operation. I said, oh, bad luck. That's what she's there for. She's there to roughen people up and to she would discuss her work program with me, but she could also have own motion inquiries into the intelligence services, and she did. And Phil, you'll be aware of one where the then Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff had a working relationship with the head of the SIS at the time, Mr. Tucker, which involved you, and a release of documents about you. And the Inspector General came out, was severely critical.
Of the SIS, I hasten to add.
Of the SIS, and as a consequence of which she said there needed to be a private secretary, intelligence, in the office of the minister, so that there was a proper channeling of information and a degree of independence. And so that came to pass, and it's been the case ever since. So an Inspector General of Defence was appointed after the Burnham inquiry, and likewise to make sure that the Defence Force is acting in accordance with both New Zealand law and international law. And Justice Tim Brewer, who's just about to retire from the High Court after 15 years as a judge, and has a very good man. He's going to be the Inspector General of Defence, and he just, I imagine, is going to roughen up a few people, and that's a very good thing. So I think there's a case for that. The real issue for me is what's going to be the relationship between an Inspector General and the IPCA, or Independent Police Complaints Authority, that receives complaints but has a very, very limited own motion jurisdiction. So whether that continues to exist in that form with an Inspector General, I think these are important issues. But that's a very long-winded answer to your question. I think an Inspector General of Police is a very good thing, and an Inspector General who has the power to ring up the Commissioner and say, well, I'm going to look at this, and this week, and so get yourselves organised.
Yeah, look, there's no doubt about it that with the serious misjudgment that happened at the top level of the police hierarchy in the latest McSkimming affair, there needs to be better oversight over the police. I don't go as far as Mark Mitchell and the Minister for State Services went, Judith Collins. I don't think it was corruption. I think that was bad, should not have been used in that way, and Mark Mitchell has apologised. But undoubtedly, the judgments that were made at the top level, including by a guy was paid $670,000 a year, means that there was a serious failure in policing, a number of serious failures. But there's two things you could do, and maybe it's both and rather than an either or. First of all, the Police Complaints Authority is under-resourced. The previous chair of it said that. They have a budget of about $5 million and 40 staff, but they're overlooking a body that now employs 15,000 people. And it's the most important group to which Parliament devolves authority over people's lives and behaviour, the powers of arrest, etc. It not only needs to be better resourced, but it needs to be more independent, and it needs to be able to, I think, to be able to prosecute rather than simply give advice to the police about what they should be doing about themselves. But the Inspector General idea that Chris has raised, I think, is one that needs close examination as well. I had, as leader of the opposition, I was briefed by the director of the SIS on a quarterly basis, and he had run through the things that we're doing, and it was designed to make sure that both sides of the House, both major parties, had confidence in what the SIS was doing and some degree of oversight over it. And there was an incident where some Israelis were in Christchurch at the time of the February 2011 earthquake, and they were reported, I think in the Southland Times, as being members of the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad. Now, I'd picked that up. If I'd been fully briefed on that, I would remember it well, because at the time I was foreign minister, we had the situation of the Israelis coming over here, taking the names of dead New Zealanders and using passports to give to their spies in other countries, and I was deeply offended by that. So the guy, Warren Tucker, who was the director at the time, said that he had fully briefed me on it, and I said I didn't recall having any such briefing. I insisted that he came and saw me, and we reached an agreement that he didn't fully brief me, but he flicked past the fact that there'd been a report into these Israelis. He didn't think there was much to it, and he may have held up a document in his hand, and I looked at the first page. It was not a full briefing. There were 3 key papers that would have been a full briefing that the Prime Minister got. And when I denied that there'd been a thorough briefing, this was picked up politically. And what happened was that people in the Prime Minister's office, Phil Dejew was one of them, I think, and the other was a guy called Jason Eade, worked in collaboration with a guy called Cameron Slater that people know as Whale Oil. They gave him all of the information that they had got from the Director General and turned it into a political attack on me. Now, the first thing is, if you want bipartisanship, which you do need with the SIS and the Government Communications Security Bureau, you don't play politics with it like that. But the Director General, this happened in 2011, it was used as a weapon against me. In 2014, there was a guy called Nicky Hager that wrote a book called Dirty Politics, and he said that there was direct collusion between the Prime Minister's office and Whale Oil, which indeed there was. And Cheryl Gwynne, who was the Inspector General, did a full report. She used her powers to summons people. She looked at 22 people within the SIS and the Prime Minister's office. She demanded all the papers from the SIS and came out with, and I looked it up, I read it again last night actually at about midnight, but the report from Cheryl Gwynne was damning of the SIS. It said that they had released, and I'm quoting here, incomplete, inaccurate and misleading information, that they had been, there were serious errors of judgment. They lacked professionalism, risked the appearance of partiality, and detracted from the due democratic oversight of the SIS. I was delighted, of course, that came out and vindicated me, but it was 3 years too late. But it did show to me that a person that is totally independent, she is now I think a High Court judge, Chris? Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Did a thorough report and again didn't pull her punches. Well, she did in a way. The act that gives her powers said that she has no power to examine the propriety of the actions of the minister in charge of the SIS, which at the time I think probably was John Key. John denied that he had anything to do with it. I frankly don't believe that. It was highly political. Their focus of attack is always on the leader of the opposition. That's the person that's after your job. But, you know, it frankly was a really disturbing incident. But this report by the Inspector General was effective. It got to the basis of the truth and condemned it. And I got the due apology from Rebecca Kitteridge, who was there by then the director of the SIS. But it showed that that system did work. And I think that would be a valuable addition to oversight over the police and misconduct by the police, even at the highest levels, as was the case, in fact, with the SIS.
Yes, that was the first matter I had to deal with as the minister. So I had to answer questions in the House about it because politically I was responsible. But I agree with Phil. I think the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security has to stir things up from time to time because of the huge power that both those agencies have. And it's the old question of who guards the guardians.
My only question on this, and I'd be interested in your take, well, both your takes actually. And you outlaid the timeline, Phil. Obviously, what happened to you happened in 2011. It wasn't until 2014 that the investigation was started, and then it wasn't for another a certain amount of time before the report came out. That's obviously not going to help in a situation like we've had with Jeff and McSkimming. So, is there what else could we be looking at to put in place for the shorter term? There were clearly warning signs here. Why weren't they picked up? Or is the power of an Inspector General such a sort of a large axe to wield as they're going in on their own accord and looking for things that would force the police force to basically toe the line a little bit more? I know this is the second time I've used that term today, but toe the line a little bit more and do things more by the book, because at any stage they could be asked to explain why they took a certain action.
Well, that's why I say it has to be a both and rather than an either or. It did take 3 years in my case. It's taken several years in the case of Ms. Z, as she's referred to in the IPCA report. But in the end, you do get justice. And justice delayed is justice denied. It's better to have justice in the end and the truth to come out. I think if the IPCA had more power, more resources, they could respond more quickly. But the Inspector General has a wider role than that, and that is to examine the effectiveness of the agency that they are in charge of in terms of their compliance with principles and procedures that they should be following. But if you've got both under-resourced, then look, I think the IPCA picks up 2% of the complaints that are referred to it, 2%. And then it has to do all the cases where there's been a police shooting, where there's been a fatality or a serious injury. So it is about resourcing, and it is about having organisations that are sufficiently independent that they can actually get to the heart of the matter quite quickly and can't be fobbed off by either the minister or by the department that they're looking at.
Yeah, but I agree, resourcing's key. And also at this critical time, making sure that the policy is carefully thought through. Now, hopefully there will be something in place before the election, which means there's not very much time at all. But what we probably need is a police conduct section of the Policing Act that defines the role of the IPCA, defines the role of an Inspector General, and then just make sure that the officers are set up and they're well resourced. Because I recall with the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, at one stage there was, you'd have a retired judge and a secretary for half the time. Now there are 4 or 5 staff, and that is as it should be. And I imagine that Justice Brewer will be setting up a similar team with the Inspectorate General of Defence. So these things will cost money, but if you are to have these bodies, they have to be properly resourced so they can do their job quickly and effectively, because a 3-year delay in resolving a matter is unacceptable.
And you're looking at quality of staff rather than quantity. Yeah, I remember that Cheryl Gwynn had working with her Ben Keith, who was Sir Ken Keith's son.
That's right.
And I dealt with him through the inquiry they were doing. Very, very good guy, and a guy that wasn't scared to go in and ask all the hard questions. You need that. If you have somebody that's, with all due respect from my position to people who are retired, you're not going to get the drive and the energy and the determination that you really want to get.
We will move on from that and eagerly await what gets put up by the coalition government in terms of their solution to this. And hopefully we'll be able to come back and have a wholehearted discussion on what we think about that when it does come. But we'll move on to the third topic for today, which is the Regulatory Standards Bill. And the word regulation conjures up all sorts of emotions across the country: good, bad, boring. And last week, the Regulatory Standards Bill, or RSB, passed its third reading, which means it will become law next year. In a nutshell, if you haven't heard of this bill, basically it was introduced as part of the coalition agreement and is a hobby horse of the ACT Party. It's the fourth attempt to get similar legislation through the government in about a 20-year period. And its promoters, i.e. David Seymour and his friends, say it'll force the government to recognise the impacts of regulations on private citizens, as well as make better regulation. And its detractors, the opposition at the moment, say that it enshrines neoliberal ideology like individual liberties into law, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And Labor have in fact said that as soon as they get into government, they will repeal this law. So my question for you, Chris, is who is correct? Is this ideology or is this good law? How does it stand in your books?
Well, my first response to the RSB is that it's redundant. Many years ago, the Law Commission wrote what I thought was an excellent paper on making legislation more readily available to the people, having clear legislation and so on. And so we passed the Legislation Act. And I always recall some snide commenter, because I was very interested in the area as Attorney General, pushing this through, and someone said, oh, it's a piece of third-term legislation at the end of the first term. But it's incredibly important. And what motivated me was Miriam Dean's report on the whey protein scandal, where various statutory instruments she couldn't find without a great deal of effort because they weren't readily available. So I said, well, all that sort of stuff has to be online, instantly available. So the Legislation Act dealt with making legislation available, setting out principles for clear construction of statutes, setting out principles for revision of statutes, updating the Act's Interpretation Act and bringing those principles in. And it was a good piece of work. And David Parker then amended it further when the Parliamentary Council were ready to bring in the idea of all secondary and tertiary instruments need to be online and instantly available. So the structure was all there, but to inject into it, if you like, the ACT view of legislation simply makes the whole process of lawmaking ideological. And what it could result in is, if there's a centre-left government, they repeal all that and inject their view of things. So every time a government comes in, we'll get their ideology into the Legislation Act, or whatever it's called, regulatory standards legislation, and then someone will come along and insert theirs. And it's a crazy way of making legislation. So all I say is that the work that was done over a period of years by both David Parker and me to get the Legislation Act developed and address some of those important questions, one of which was raised by Miriam Dean, a very distinguished Auckland King's Counsel in the whey protein scandal, that dealt with the issue. And it doesn't need to be ideological. So I have no doubt at all that any future government will repeal this stuff. I just hope they don't insert their version of legislative truth, because I don't think it does.
Yeah, well, I agree with all of that. What's probably the most important thing that you're looking for bipartisanship on are the sort of principles behind what's good, how to make good legislation, how to make good regulations. And ideology shouldn't come into it, whether it's left or right. It's about making regulations that meet accepted and agreed principles by the vast majority of legislators and by the wider population. I think it's a reflection on this act that there were 23,000 submissions and 0.33%, a third of 1%, supported the legislation. And I don't look at I know where people are coming from on submissions, and so Jane Kelsey's opposed to it. Well, I know Jane, and I know she would be opposed to it. So I've left aside the people that you could predict on the left and the right would have an ideological view. But when I look at it, the sound and the sensible people that are looking for good, straight legislation and good regulation making were unanimously opposed to this. There's a thing called, what is it, the Legislation Design and Advisory Committee. This consists of some
That's
key
right.
people from, the Crown Law Office, from Parliamentary Council, from top academics, lawyers, people in departments. And they made a submission, and I looked at their submission, and it said, first of all, it's not necessary because you've already got things that do what it claims that it's going to do. But the second objection was, I thought, really important. They said, the principles contained in the bill are selective and deeply contestable. Now, that goes to Chris's point. The last thing you want is to have principles that a minority of people agree to, but the vast majority of people don't. And then they said that the bill has potential for significant constitutional impact that hasn't been fully explored. This is pure politics. It's pure ideology. It's a waste of time. Labor has said that they're going to repeal it in the first 100 days. And with you, I hope that they're not going to put something in. And I don't think they would put something in that came at the same biased angle, but from a left-wing perspective. This is just bad legislation. And everything says that it's wasted Parliament's time, it's going to waste money, it's going to slow down legislation, and it says property rights are more important than any other rights, so that if regulations are against you, then the government's got to justify that, don't mind that, but then they've got to compensate you if the regulations damage your business. So if you're a tobacco company and you're promoting a product that we know kills 5,000 people a year, and the government wants to regulate against you, according to the principles in this bill, we'd have to compensate the tobacco industry for not killing 5,000 people a year. That's just rubbish.
Phil raises an interesting point about protection of property rights, because do you remember Gordon Copeland,
Yeah.
who was a United Future MP? He introduced a Bill of Rights amendment bill, I think it was 2006, 2007, to get property rights recognised in the Bill of Rights. And there are precedents for it. The bill was voted down, and I know Gordon was very disappointed because of the huge amount of work that would be required to be done were property rights to be inserted in the Bill of Rights, and the potential for further litigation would be extraordinary. So it's a step that I think both National and Labor in 2006, 2007 said this needs a great deal of care and a lot of research, and you don't charge in where angels fear to tread. And yet I think that's what the coalition government has done with this legislation. So I don't think we're necessarily aware of what the byproduct of the legislation is going to be over the next little period.
And I just want to ask, actually, on the select committee submissions, and Phil, you mentioned it earlier on. So 98% of people, or roughly 98% of people, were opposed to this. One of the things that David Seymour is saying is that, oh yeah, but they were just bots. And what he means by bots, just to really break that down, is people that were opposed to this legislation provided templates in which people could make submissions, and easily make submissions. So a great majority of them said the same thing, even though they were probably coming from individual people that opposed the legislation. My question here is, do we think, is that just a good news story for the people opposing this legislation, or did that make a meaningful difference to the select committee process, Bill?
Well, in the select committee, because you very rarely have the time to read every submission, particularly if you've got 23,000 submissions, just not possible if you're a member of that committee. but you pick out the submissions, not based on partisanship or whatever, but from people that might have something that can add to the process and understand what the point of the legislation or having legislation like that is. And so, look, I don't care. I mean, I don't know that there's any evidence that they're bots. There may well be a mass submission process where, a standard format, that happens quite a lot. But it's easy. You look at one of those and you dismiss the other 999 that are almost identical. So you know what they're all saying. You don't have to read each one of them. But you look for the people that can really add something and have some insight into what you're trying to do. And they're the people that really should be the ones that influence the select committee in their examination.
Okay, and I guess that probably brings us to the end of the episode today, unless there was anything else anyone wanted to add.
No, sorry I've been so legal today, but as we can see, many of the issues we're talking about raise important legal questions, so expect me to pronounce. Oh, sorry.
I reckon it's
No-
really
no
good
apology
because
needed.
this is an eminent KC, and we would be paying $1,000 for a 10-minute slot to get that advice, and we're getting it for nothing.
All I have to do is buy my
Oh,
copy.
no, I'm not eminent. I'm just a washed-up attorney, but I'm interested in this stuff. And I'm really interested in the Legislation Act because I just remember people said, what a yawn. But actually, it was working. And instead, they've ripped out chunks of it and inserted all this ideological
If
nonsense.
it's working, don't fix it. That's always a good adage.
And on that note, we will end the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening. Follow our social channels on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and I think on Facebook as well. And we will see you next Tuesday. Thank you very much, guys.